Hi, hello, how you doing? For today's video, I am going to be talking about 5 lessons that I learned from writing my last book. Back in July, I finished writing the book that I had been working on since 2020. And this was mainly the only project that I worked on during those 4 years. I wrote maybe a few stories, like short stories that never got edited, never really went anywhere. This was a book that was my main project for 4 years straight. I tried to start a second book, that didn't work out. For now, that book is shelved. I never even finished the first draft. But I have to say that during those 4 years, I learned a lot about myself as a writer, not necessarily how to edit 101 or anything like that, but things about myself as a writer that I thought would be interesting to share with you guys. So let's get into it. So a little background for the book that we are talking about. I never planned in the first place for this to turn into a book. I came back to writing from a pretty extended break. I didn't write anything for a good 3 years. From give or take 2017 to 2020, I didn't write anything at all just because of some personal stuff that I had going on in my life. It just wasn't something that I was doing at all at that point. So when I came back to writing, I decided that I wanted to start with a couple of short stories rather than a full-length novel, especially because up until that point, I'd only ever written fantasy. My main genre now is thriller. I haven't really written anything fantasy-wise, aside from a book that I tried to start when I first got back into writing, but I wrote a very small outline, which never doing that again. And maybe the first few chapters before I was like, this is not what I want to do anymore, this is not something that I enjoy anymore, I want to look into the thriller genre. I wrote one short story in the thriller genre, my very first thriller story in general, that I'm actually currently rewriting with the knowledge of writing that I have now, and just a comparative to seeing how much I've changed in 4 years as a writer. I'm now rewriting and re-editing that story from start to finish. This story came right after that. There may have been one story in between, but I'm honestly not completely sure of the order of all of those three. I know that this short story that ultimately turned into this book was the third one. So the other two, I don't know. The concept was very, very simple because I didn't want to challenge myself yet too much, considering that this was a brand new genre for me. I didn't know what I was doing. So the baby concept was a girl who got kidnapped and she is trying to escape from her kidnapper, essentially. The original premise of the story would just be literally her escaping, like doing the actual escaping rather than like finding a way and like plotting and everything in order to escape. This was just gonna be something of like, oh, she finds a way to open a door and she runs. And the story would be the time from when she first wakes up in, at the time, a shed to when she finds the police, like a police station or a police car that drives by. I don't know. It was something along those lines. However, the ideas kind of kept coming, and very, very soon I realized that I had too many ideas, that this was no longer a short story. This had turned into a full-length novel. So I decided to just give it a shot. Let me just write this full-length novel and see where it takes me. See what I can do with this. 4 years later, that novel is now finished, and I am going to use it to, for the first time, look for an agent. Writing this book was a journey. I would definitely not recognize it from the first draft. I have actually found some pages back from the first draft, and I honestly do not recognize it. So many characters have been cut, so many characters have been added. The book was at one point 172,000 words long. This book went through a lot to get where it is today, and that means that I learned quite a bit about myself as a writer, because this was hours upon hours upon hours of working on this book. A total of 6 drafts, one specifically to get the word count down because this book was massive. Managed to cut 30K in just one draft. And here we are now, with me starting a brand new book, and this one temporarily shelved until I start sending it out to agents. I am not ready. Emotionally speaking, I am not ready. I want to crawl in a hole and stay there, okay? Hey, can I just do that? Can I just crawl into a hole and an agent comes find me there? I'd like that a lot better, actually. And within that time, the first lesson that I truly had to learn was to allow my story to grow at its own pace. It's put a lot of pressure on myself, not just in writing, but just in everyday situations. I tend to take that pretty far. I can have full-on panic attacks because of how much pressure I am putting on myself, especially when it comes to something that I'm quite proud of. Something that means a lot to me, like a project or just something in general that I'm working on. It doesn't really have to be like a personal project or anything of the sort. But very specifically, when I started writing this book, I used to believe that if your book wasn't good by a certain draft, I think what I had in mind at the time was like draft 3-ish, then your book was bad and you as a writer sucked. That was a major misbelief that I held, and it really controlled my writing life for a very, very long time. So much so that I actually restarted draft 3 because I really wasn't happy with where it was going. I don't know if I would still restart that draft now with how much less pressure I tend to put on myself. I think a big part of it was that I maybe underestimated how hard it would be to come back to writing after taking such a long and extended break. I kind of had to relearn how to write in a sense. And that was much harder than I expected. I kind of expected to just go back into it and be like, oh yeah, this is fine. I still know how to do this. Let's go. I do not want to read that first draft back because of just how bad it is. The book that I'm writing now, the first draft, I mean, it's still bad. It's the first draft. It's actually, in this case, a 0 draft. But it's still better than whatever that was. That first draft was something else. And it really... Well, once I finished writing it, I remember the very specific moment that I finished writing it, I was very happy with it. I was incredibly proud of myself. And then I started editing. And I realized how much work the book needed. And what I now know is completely normal when it comes to writing books and editing books and everything of the sort, I at the time perceived as something negative on myself. But then the more drafts that I wrote, the more that I realized that the story just needed time to come into its own. The more ideas that I started to add, the more that I started to work on the characters, as well as just the fact that I learned to give myself the time to do so, all of a sudden, the book didn't seem as bad as I did before. I started to realize very, very slowly that the book just really, truly needed time. As well as the fact that it was majorly overwritten, which I've made a video before on overwriting and the issues that it can cause. I felt that my whole book was ruined just because of how long it was, which we're gonna get into that in a second, but it caused a lot of problems in my book, and I took that as something personal, something that was wrong with me, something that I felt like I wasn't talented enough to write the story when really it just needed time to come into its own. And my anxiety took that thought process and just ran with it. And it was very, very hard to get rid of that thought process. Some books I realize now need 2 drafts to be good, some need 5, some need 6, some need 7, 8, 9, or 10. And that is completely normal depending on what kind of a story that you are writing. And I would never again put that much pressure on myself to have a good book or a good story by draft X, Y, or Z, specifically draft 3. For some reason, draft 3 was where I said,
this book has to be amazing.
Number 2, word count does not make a book either bad or good. There's this major, I don't know if I would call it a stigma around word count, but I guess I would call it a stigma, because I can't think of another word at the minute. But there is this understanding within the writer community, even if you are not planning to publish, that your book should be between this many words depending on the genre. Now, my book happens to be a bit longer than what the guidelines would be. Nothing major. It's still sitting around 120K, which is still acceptable. It's, I believe, sitting at 122, which I might see if I can get rid of those 2K words. I don't know yet. But as I said earlier, this book at one point was 172,000 words. Yes, it was majorly overwritten. But even now, having a book that is finished, as in finished before getting an editor and an agent and editing it all over again, I realized that just because a book is longer doesn't mean that a book is bad. It really doesn't. People especially told me a lot that when you are looking to publish your debut, it should be around, 90,000, max 100,000 words. And I now, through my own research, have found that a big part of that is bull. A lot of books, debut books that are insanely popular, are actually on the longer end of what would be considered the guidelines. These are just recommendations. It's not like your book can be 120,001 words and all of a sudden it's unpublishable. But the guidelines usually sit at like max 120K, right? But there are so many debut books that have been published over these last few years, and even like going back longer, like the early 2000s, 1990s, that went incredibly far over that word count and are still considered amazing books till this day. Let's, for example, look at The Secret History. That book is not only massive in page count, but there is so much text on each page, and the author herself, I don't remember which article it was, said that the book was over 120,000. If you look online at like an estimate of how long the book is, you arrive at least 150K. And The Secret History is still one of the best books ever written, or at least that's how a lot of people will see it, myself included. It is actually my favorite book of all time. And there are many books like that that were over the recommended word count, and people loved it. And those books did get sold to major publishers, and those books were successful. The books that you also see on your shelf that are like 400 pages, just because a book is 400 pages does not mean that it sits at a certain word count. A book sits at 400 pages depending on how much space there is between the lines. How long a book is also depends on whether it's written in Times New Roman, Garamond, and so on and so forth. That is what determines page count. Not only how long the book is. Obviously, it has something to do with that, but not everything. But just to conceptualize it, I literally found a list of 900 books, debut books, that were traditionally published that were over 500 pages. Just because a book is sitting at 100,000 words flat doesn't mean that it's a good book. If the book actually needs 120k words in order to tell the whole story, give proper character depth, give the characters time to grow, give the plot the chance to play out without it being rushed, then the book sitting at 100,000 words is a bad idea, because it means that you did your book a disservice. As a writer, you know what is best for your story, and I had to really massively learn that. I had to learn that this was my story, and if it needed another 1,000 words to be told, then that was okay. And if in the end it turned out that it needed 1,000 less, then I, as a writer, would know that. I, at some point, would figure out that this book needed to be less. I used beta readers, none of whom told me that the book needed to be shorter. They told me to work on the characters, and they told me to work a bit more on their relationships with each other, but they didn't tell me that the book needed to be shorter. And when I started to accept that, I started to see my story fully come into its own. When I started caring about quality rather than quantity, I started to notice that my story really took on a life of its own. The character depth came into play, and it really turned into the story that it is now, something that I am incredibly proud of. Number 3 was when to stop editing. I am a major perfectionist. When I start something, I want it to be perfect, and the moment that it isn't, I get major imposter syndrome. I look at other authors and see how much just I like their books, and really start to feel like, damn, if I can't live up to this, then I am a horrible writer. So when I started really taking this book and the editing process specifically seriously, that took a toll on my mental health, because the perfectionism that I have really came into play. I did not like the idea of getting off of my computer and leaving a scene not perfect. I wanted those scenes to be flawless, because that is what I saw from the books on my own shelf. I would look at my favorite books and be like, but my book isn't that good yet. And my self-confidence as a writer instantly took a nosedive. So I would keep editing and editing and editing and editing. And I became obsessed with the idea of how many drafts other people wrote for their stories, and felt that if I went over that amount, then I was a bad writer. Then I didn't do it well enough. And I noticed that again now that I am working on my query letter. I actually ended up asking a friend of mine, how many drafts did you write for your query letter? She actually has an agent. And she refused to tell me, which I am still very grateful for, because now I don't have anything to compare myself with. Instead of taking inspiration from authors that I really look up to, I started comparing myself with them. My books were never as good as theirs. My word choice was never as good as theirs. The quotes that I wrote would never live up to the quote in X, Y, or Z. I started to wonder whether I was a good writer at all, whether I could ever learn how to write properly, because I wasn't Stephen King, I wasn't Karen Slaughter, I wasn't any of these authors that I looked up to so much. My perfect solution was to keep editing forever. And it literally pushed me into burnout. I wrote every single day for a full year, and I wrote non-stop. If I wasn't eating, if I wasn't sleeping, I was writing. And then I pushed myself into burnout as a result of it. I could not write a single word, because the imposter syndrome would just instantly grab me around my neck, and I would quit. This is something I'm still working through a little bit now. I definitely do tend to get more anxious when I am writing. I'm a very anxious person, so, I mean, not fully surprising, but if I hadn't pushed myself into burnout, maybe that now wouldn't be the case. I stopped taking into account the fact that these were authors who had, again, agents and editors who had looked over their book meticulously. I was doing it on my own with the help of a few beta readers as well as a few friends of mine who read over some of the chapters. But that was it. I didn't have an agent. I didn't have an editor who looked over my work each and every time that I wrote something. And yet I was comparing myself to people who did, which is very problematic. And I wanted to keep going until my book was perfect. I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel until the book was perfect. Now at the end of draft 6, when I finished that one, I was very surprised to find myself kind of sitting there like, okay, the book isn't perfect, but it's not supposed to be. I told the story that I wanted to tell. I'm happy with these characters. I'm happy with the plot. I'm happy with all of their relationships. This is good enough. And this is something that I am proud of, and this is something that I want to share with people. And that is good enough. There was still that perfectionist part of me that was definitely wanting to choke me in that moment. But I was happy with what I wrote, and I was happy with the story that I told, and I can say that I still am. And lastly, how to use my writing in order to help heal myself. This is about to get a little bit personal, so if that is something that you don't want to listen to, just skip this part of the video. But for context, I have PTSD from childhood abuse. And I didn't get diagnosed with PTSD until I was 15, bordering on 16. I got diagnosed with PTSD in September, October of 2019, and I started writing again in 2020, beginning of 2020, so give or take half a year later. And I could have never expected how much writing this specific story would heal me and heal some parts of myself that I could have never expected to even look at before I started writing this book. A major part of the book is addiction. And I, as a teenager, used to have an addiction to my anxiety medication. However, I was in full denial when I started writing this book. And as I started to write it and do research on addiction and everything of the sort, because the main character is a recovered addict, I started to realize that maybe I used to have a problem. I was no longer on that medication at that point. I'm still not. It was actually taken off of the market. But it was not something I was ready to face when I started writing this book. Until I started doing research and reading other people's stories and really started to accept of like, okay, maybe I used to have a problem, but I'm recovered now, and that is okay. And that was really, really hard for me to accept. There are also some other parts in the book that I never did it consciously that really related back to my personal life. Like some relationships that I have with people that were really messed up, that were not necessarily healthy, that I learned with the combination of therapy and writing the book really were not okay. And again, this was not something that I did consciously. I was never like, ooh, I'm having this problem in my life, let me put it into my book and explore it. That was never what happened. The book just kind of took on a life of its own, and somehow, in some ways, it did relate back personally to me. It wasn't the type of thing where it was like I was like self-inserting. It was more like, this is the life that the book has taken on, and now if you wish to continue writing this book, you will have to face some stuff that you don't like. Which caused me to almost quit on a couple of occasions, because that was hard. It forced me to look at some things that I didn't always feel ready to do. I was ready, I just didn't feel ready to look at some of these things. There were points where I genuinely hated the fact that I had even started this book, Because now I had to look at these things while if I hadn't been writing this book, I could have continued to live in bliss until my therapist pulled me out of that because I have a darn good therapist. If I hadn't written this book, I don't know where I would be today. I just know that I would not be in the spot that I am right now. I know that I would not be filming right now because I wouldn't have the confidence. I know that I wouldn't be in the relationship that I'm in because I would not have the self-love that I have today. And I know that this is very sentimental, so I'm gonna shut up in a minute. But writing this book really, really helped me heal from some of the stuff that I went through. When I was younger, used to use writing as a way to escape already. That was always there. I was writing stories before I even properly liked reading. I had a lot of trouble reading growing up. It wasn't something that immediately clicked in my brain of how to properly read. But I was already writing stories before I really learned to like reading as a whole. I actually still have the book that caused me to suck my love for reading, which is this one, The Iron King by Julie Kagawa. But even before I read that one, I was already writing stories to escape from some of the things that were happening. So the idea that I can now use it to help heal some parts of me that I wasn't ready before to really look at in a safe environment, I can tell you that did a booster on my mental health and my self-confidence. So this was all that I have for you guys today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I know that it is a little bit different from what I usually do, but I don't know, I just really wanted to make this video. I thought that it would be a fun video to make, so I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see more from my channel, then please subscribe, hit the bell button so that you get notified whenever I post a new video. If you have any type of videos that you want to see on my channel, leave them in the comments down below, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye!